I actually, I usually stand and move around when I teach my classes. But this time, since I have a presentation, I'm going to sit down. So I apologize for this non-American way of presenting my material. Just a quick, let me make sure that the microphone is close enough so that you, is this okay? You think, okay. So, introductions, in this case, I want to underline the fact that it is an introduction to digital literature. So there could be many introductions to what we call electronic literature, e-literature. This is kind of an old-fashioned term, okay? The new, we'll see that there are other definitions. The most common today is digital literature or digital media art, when digital literature is, of course, part of this galaxy of digital media arts, or more specifically, as my colleague, and we'll see him, I invited him to join us today via video. John Cayley talks about instead digital language arts, slightly different from the idea of e-literature. But I would like to, that's what I'm going to talk about today, okay? An introduction. So my introduction, which is very, very specific from a very specific point of view, even from a very specific place, which is Brown University, which has an important role in the development of digital literature, but it certainly does not represent the whole of this evolving phenomenon. So, general premise, first point, literature is already electronic and has been for a while. Ever since we have begun to use computers and personal computers and other devices, nowadays, even if you write with a pen and you want to publish and share, you know, the result of your writing, either you take a picture and and publish it as a PDF, etc., or if you publish even a printed book, as you know, publishers will turn your analog text into digital text. Okay, so this is a very important, that has important consequences, and this is one of the leading themes for what I'm going to talk about today. How is my English? I mean, is it okay? I have an Italian accent, so it should be understandable. But if I speak too fast, if I accelerate, slow me down, and I'll be happy to, and we'll leave also ample time at the end to play around with some of the ideas that I'm going to introduce. But nevertheless, electronic literature specifically, or digital language arts, if you wish to adopt a broader definition, have a history, okay? A short history or prehistory, I would say. And in my mind, actually, this history has already ended. We have really entered into a different phase. I call, and what I'm going to talk about today is, this is a little preview, it's one aspect of that prehistory of electronic literature, very much linked and tied to what happened at Brown in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Starts far back, okay, and evolves with the technology, etc. I'll give you some samples of that. But that history, to some extent, has already come to an end, in a sense that years ago, I and many others talked about digital incunabula. You know, in the history of print, of course, you know that for about at least 50 years, probably more, there's been a transition from manuscript to the codex, to the printed codex, and that transition is called the age of incunabula, no? From 14, maybe if we have an expert that can tell us exact dates, etc. So within the Gutenberg paradigm, there is already a period of time in which, of course, there is a transition in progress, you know, from manuscript to printed culture, And this is the point I like to make, because I'll go back and apply it to our concept of digital literature. Text and digital text, printed text and digital text are reversible to some extent. Okay, thanks to, so we have examples in the late 15th century of printed books, I'm sorry, of manuscripts that were copied from printed books, okay? You know, I can think particularly of one, Ferrara belongs to the Este family, but there are many. You know, splendidly illuminated manuscripts taken from printed, copied from printed. So there is a reversibility already there, and I'm going to go back because that reversibility is also present in our digital incunabula, and poses a number of interesting issues for our idea of what is digital literature, etc. Okay, so that's the second thing that we're going to do today, the short history, Brown-centric history of it. I have some invited speakers, so since today, if you go on the internet or you find hundreds, thousands possibly of sites that claim to be or are indeed, you know, offer indeed what we call digital literary experience, okay? And there are a lot of introductions to digital literature. Some of them are quite good. In 5 minutes, they really give you a sense, much better than a seminar can do. So I thought, after telling my role, or better, the sort of the Brown prehistory of digital, we are going to go to invite some of these experts to join us, and we're going to look at a couple of those videos and comment about. And last point, yes, at the end of the class, I hope we'll be able to take a closer look to some of these works of digital language arts and perhaps play together, and maybe you have some examples of what you've encountered of your, if you're actually engaged in digital language arts, what your idea of digital language arts, and I'll invite you to share those with me. It's too bad I teach in a class usually where everybody is connected to the main screen with a computer, so we can easily switch, but we can certainly do that here. All right, so now, I don't know if you know this important critic, Nancy Catherine Hales, and this is one of the introductory points I wanted to make. She's the author of several influential books, including How We Became Posthuman and other. She used to be at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Now she moved to Duke University. Among the other things, she wrote this essay that in 2007, so we're talking about 10 years ago already. Can you see? Is this clear enough? All right. And as I was telling Francesca, I'm going to share the PowerPoint so you'll have all the references, and if you want to go back and visit this. This is an essay that then became a book that came with a CD. And the book was published in 2009 or 2010 or something like that. But one of the points that Nancy Catherine Hales, Kate Hales, makes in her book is, it goes back to this idea of reversibility of text and digital, printed text, digital text, and specifying that in the digital era, both print and electronic texts are supported by code. Okay, we introduce this. I don't know, some of you may have a background in programming, and they know what code is. There are many different possibilities, and what we're going to talk about here is really the relationship of code to text and in general to digital language arts. It's an important, so this reversibility that we talked about between printed text and manuscript in the age of incunabula. and this reversibility of printed text and electronic text in the age of digital incunabula is actually facilitated in the age of digital incunabula by code. There is this mediator, and it's very important to understand, because we introduce another notion of reversibility, which is that between code and text, even digital text. And what she means is that the output, print is one of the outputs of the electronic text, okay? But more importantly, electronic text, what we call electronic text specifically, remains distinct from print, even from print that is printed from an electronic text, in that it literally cannot be accessed until it is performed by properly executed code. Okay? So it's the notion of the born digital, but it's also the notion that if print is one of the outputs of digital text, in reality, digital text, digital literary text in particular, can only be accessed through the devices that process code, okay? So in print, and there are some interesting ideas and contamination. For example, code is art, one possible consequence. And there are, by the way, stop me anytime if I lose you, okay? If what I'm saying is not clear, if you want to go back to I want to make it really a seminar, interactive, like all digital literature should really be, But code is art. Some code art, for instance, is one of the instantiation of electronic literature, in which the work, the writing, is done mostly on code and not necessarily on text, because text is executed through code. So, text is commanded by code. So the real creative work, if you wish, is done on code, on programming in general, and can take many different forms, mediated sometimes by software, okay? We have literary genres in electronic literature that are associated to specific software, for instance, or application. For instance, flash poems. At some point they became fashionable because they were executed in Flash. Remember Flash? Still around, to some extent. But here, but there is a different level of intervention by, writers. So some writers, for example, in a sense, skip the whole electronic code text connection and go directly to other kind of objects, aesthetic objects produced directly by code, okay, through code and thanks to code. And are they a new form of writing? Are they a new form of painting? Are they a new form of, what kind of artistic aesthetic object are they? They're clearly generated by code. It's code. But code and randomness can also, interact in a way that is very interesting from the point of view of the aesthetic production. In other words, code can replace written language and generate its own aesthetic objects, whether textual or not. And for example, a few years ago, Nick Montfort, which is one who works at MIT, is a professor of digital media or digital, and he works on, and is also one of the promoter of the electronic literature organization. We'll talk about that in a moment. He and 9 others or 10 others co-authors wrote this book, strange book, that the title, look at the title. The title is, I don't know if you can read, 10 print, that string, that line of code. And basically their book, a printed book, is a book about creative computing, as they call it, okay? Creative computing, as an eminently collaborative work, a work done by team rather than by a single author. Authorship, of course, is also a notion in evolution when we talk about the transition and digital incunabula, etc. And it does so through a line of basic code written for the Commodore 64, an old computer. I don't know if you remember the computer. I have vague memories of it. I never used the Commodore. But this line of code was written by a very young Bill Gates, okay? So it has a very interesting history, this code. The dissemination of this code, the implication of this code, the cultural history of this code is very much part of what Nick Mumford and his co-authors talk about. As an example, another example of an alternative way to look at electronic literature, digital literature, which is code. For instance, what did this code do, this line of code? You see it. It's that kind of random pattern that you see on the cover of the book, no? Okay, so it's one of those strange aesthetic, random aesthetic objects, yet programmed aesthetic objects, etc., etc. Some kind of visual pattern, maze, labyrinth, etc. Some kind of aesthetic production. And so they look at this line of code, Bill Gates didn't mean to make of that line of code, the process of creating electronic literature. He had other things in mind, and of course we know that they turned out pretty well for him, when he started. And but clearly Mumford and say, so okay, but let's look at it from a cultural perspective. This is really an interesting, already even this line of basic can produce an aesthetic effect. And they analyze it and play with it and replay with it. And I won't go into the book. You can purchase it online or read it online as an ebook from MIT Press. And good luck, because it's not really a great reading if you expect a work of literature, etc., or even literary criticism. But it's interesting. How many of you know BASIC? Oh, right. So maybe for those of you who know BASIC, or have an experience, etc. The manual of BASIC is part of what Mumford and he's going to analyze as a sort, almost as not a literary work, but almost as this kind of a new entry into a different level of creative computing. Okay, there is creativity that goes into code. All right, I see that some of you are kind of puzzled by it. There are more fun things coming, okay? This is just an example, which is part of the history, because the Commodore, when was it? It was in the late 70s, I would say, early 80s. So we'll see other examples of this prehistory, etc. So basically, this is an elementary example, of how computing, programmable machines or devices can be used to generate and disseminate culturally meaningful objects. Okay, is that so? A broader already in this there is a broader framework for considering electronic literature as part of a broader phenomenon. Okay, broader cultural phenomenon. Okay, including code itself. So even code itself becomes a meaningful, cultural, perhaps even artistic, language, language, or different kinds of variations on language. Okay, so this is important because when you talk to artists, serious artists, who work in digital language arts, they're really interested in in the effect and the execution, but what they really are interested in the creative way of writing the back end of there, or manipulating existing languages, or manipulating the way that existing software devices work. So this is to me, of course, another interesting declination of the reversible destiny of print and code. Print is not going to go away. Umberto Eco would say the bicycle did not go away I mean, the horse did not go away when bicycles were introduced. And when cars were introduced, the bicycle is still around, in Bologna in particular, more than in Providence. But so print is not going to go away, really, or in any time soon. But certainly, of course, as you well know, there is a different reconfiguration of how print itself works, and also this reversible destiny. And if you think about, for literature, this are important consequences. When we think of literature, we still think of books, no? And yet, digital literature, electronic literature, digital language arts was already, the statement was, oh, there is literature, there is life beyond books. In fact, there is an enormous field of literature that cannot be contained by books, and books cannot do that for you. And this is what's behind this. But the reversibility is also very, very interesting. Okay, the hybrid dimension in which we have lived in the first age of digital language arts. Montfort. Actually, Montfort here helps us introduce another aspect that we'll touch up again later with one of our invited speakers. And actually, I invited Kate Hales to talk a little bit about in a video, and pattern recognition. So the experience, the aesthetic experience that we call digital language art, and as both technical and aesthetic, and visual in particular, a different way of reading beyond words, recognizing, thanks to code, that we can recompose text in visual configurations. Very important. The visual dimension is another very important, we'll see some examples in a moment, of what we call digital language arts. To some extent, there is a spectrum that goes from text only, but already text acquires some visual properties. And this is not new in the history of literature. We'll see in a moment. There is an entire tradition in avant-garde poetry in particular, visual poetry, concrete poetry, etc., in which text was already treated. But in digital art becomes almost a necessity. Okay, and the spectrum goes to yet another limit in which text sort of doesn't disappear really, but is recycled within a media conglomerate or configuration in which text is responding to images, is treated as an image, and so on and so forth. All thanks to code that process all these relationships. And so pattern recognition, remember this, because Kate Hales is going to talk to you about in a moment, with a specific attention to pattern of randomness, okay? All right. So let's go to these are where the premise on general concepts that keep in mind as we move on to a little bit of history or prehistory, okay? How are we doing for time? Should I? Francesca, you tell me, if I'm taking too much time. No, va bene, but again, as I said, I would like to leave time to questions. And anyway, so here the historical dimension, let's say. As I said, the elite has a prehistory and has already ended. But when did it begin? That's the issue, And this is an essay, it's going to be in bibliography, written by Jill Walker Retberg, the wife of Scott Retberg. The community of electronic literary people and art tends to be a little, a small community, and they're all either married or, it's an interesting. And Jill Walker has written a number of very interesting essays reflecting on this phase of digital incunabula, etc. They're all found on a site that I will provide. It's one of the sites, the two major sites, which have archived and still archive, which another very important function digital literary arts, because without archiving these early examples, they will be completely lost. And there is a huge issue in the community of e-literature and digital literature, digital media in general, about the archiving of what is born digital in different technological stages. So there are softwares that are gone. So the issue of obsolescence, and I'll give you an example in a moment of something that I've done that I cannot retrieve with my frustration. I cannot retrieve because the platform on which it was built is all I have is a little video, but a video is not the real thing, and so on and so forth. So this, but Jill Redberg has written a number of very interesting essays about this, and this is, for example, tells us, when did it begin? When can we decide if we write a history there should be a beginning? Or many beginnings. If it's a postmodern history, a la Calvino, a la Borges, we could think that there are many parallel dimensions in which different things happen, etc. But so there are various hypotheses in this quotation. I trust you've read a little bit. I don't need to reread it. Okay. So if we take the foundation of the Electronic Literature Organization, in 1999, as the turning point, because it's the point when the archiving started, and so a history could be written to some extent, or possibilities of many histories. You can make your own history of electronic literature. If you go to the site of the Electronic Literature Organization, look at the works they have archived, and create your own path. I'm interested in this particular e-poetry rather than narrative, in some genre that you can identify, and then you carve your own path. So you're writing your own history, but in a sense, the archiving is one of the turning points when we can start talking about something that as an object of analysis, of research, etc. So the two things are very much linked, because an archive is also adopts certain points of view, certain presuppositions, so we can't archive everything. We have to select, and even all the many things that have been produced in the age of digital incunabula, many are lost. So what we have left in the archive is a snapshot of something, of a phenomenon, etc. All the internet is archived, as you know, to some extent, etc. But what is lost and what would be a long discussion, but we won't go there. By the way, Jill Redberg applies some instruments, some tools of distant reading. I don't know if you're familiar with that, developed by Franco Moretti at Stanford in order to analyze this phenomenon. And so applying distant reading not to 18th, 19th century printed novels like Franco Moretti did, but to 1990s and 2000 digital texts, and how it's also testing these tools, which is an interesting way. Again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, please stop me and say, wait, what? So Brown University, the year is 1990, when I was hired at Brown University as a relatively young assistant professor. So you can tell my age from this. And of course, when my encounter with digital language arts was, of course, mediated by the people I encountered at Brown. The first one is George Landau. You might have heard his name. He was the author of a very influential text that was published in the 90s in various editions, Hypertext. You see the 2.0, there was a 3.0. It was also translated into Italian. I don't know if all the different editions. But so the subtitle says all about his perspective. The perspective is the convergence of contemporary critical theory and technology. When I arrived, but I'm not an artist. I'm not a digital language artist. I am, a professor of Italian literature that mutated in time, doing certain things with computers, etc., and digital media that applied to both, traditional artifacts that were born analogs, as well as, to applications and objects that are born digital, of course. And during these years, I taught. At that time, I was an apprentice teacher. So hypertext became immediately, but not in 1990, as you will see in a moment. We go back to the 1970s, Brown in the experimentation with hypertext as a pedagogical tool. So we have a constellation of terms here. Artistic practices, that use hypertext as a, creative computing tool, okay, and literary tool, okay, instead of the pen, the typewriter, etc. Critical theory type of approaches like George's, in which they say, well, wait a second, post-structuralism, are you familiar with this term? All the critique, deconstruction, postmodernism in general, and the evolution of technology really converge. They converge. I mean, they are the same thing, and it's interesting to see what drives the other. Very controversial, notion at the time, but much debated and very influential, and then we have all the artistic aesthetic production, okay, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, of course, there are other influential works. I'm citing George because he's an old friend, and I really learned about, myself participating in his workshops, this. But Jay Bolter's Writing Space was another very influential. And here, writing space is the key, the spatial metaphor. The computer, in particular, opens up a new space for writing, and we'll see that that is to be taken literally, as we move on. And so I said that the history of hypertext at Brown goes back much further, much earlier. George Landau has a site, still maintains it, notwithstanding the fact he's old and not very well he's retired now, etc. But there is a short history of, there is my name there, and I'm still mad at him because he didn't link my projects. but clearly the important parts that I want to call your attention to are the first lines and the name of Andy Van Dam. Andy is Dutch, but has been working at Brown for 50 years. He celebrated his 50th anniversary teaching at Brown. He started very, very young as a computer scientist, and is one of the pioneers of graphic computing, etc. And even in the 1960s, he and Ted Nelson started. Ted Nelson is a name that you might have heard because is some consider the real inventor of the word, if not of the concept of hypertext. You know what I'm talking about when I talk about hypertext? I mean, the World Wide Web, and that's the idea that links and so on and so forth, etc. So, but I want to show you something that I found recently online. Look at the date of this article, March 14, 1969. That's a very young Andy Van Dam with the computer. It wasn't even the Commodore 64. It was a IBM 2250. Okay, and let's read the first lines of the Secretaries of the World, beware. Okay, that's from the Brown paper, the Brown Daily Herald. And say, if associate professor of computer science Andy Van Dam's new toy becomes a fad, you may all be out of a job. And in fact, that actually, to some extent, happened, the beginning of automation and the impact of computing and automation on, higher education, and we'll see in a moment also literary studies, is part of the phenomenon. Okay, then we'll go back to the creative aspects, but I want to make sure that you understand my experience has been very much also the way that computing and creative computing has changed pedagogical practices also, at Brown. This is very much a Brown experience. So Professor Van Dam calls his gadget a hypertext, since it can make sense out of a rat's nest of data. It can make sense of a rat's nest. Rat's nest vuol dire un nido di vipere, insomma, meglio, rat's nest sarebbe proprio un garbuglio, sort of something that it really is, it's messy, it's, you know, but it can make sense, you know, again. He called it the first hypertext editing system, and then this one that you see in the picture, it was called FRES, File Retrieval and Editing System, okay? And here is a vintage video, 1976 video, and I'm not going to show you it all, you know, because we don't have time, but pay attention to the, you know, this introduces another character in our story, a professor of English, very important, an authority in English and comparative literature at the time, Robert Scholes. Robert Scholes was one of the first to graduate in comparative literature at Yale from René Velek's school, etc. So one of really the pioneers, and one of the first to apply computing to, in this case, to a class in English poetry. So let's see. Let's see if we can hear.
We are inside a traditional storing house of information. All the memories of the world, all the records of our culture have been arranged in orderly fashion. As consumers of knowledge, we have the privilege of entering the past, selecting a portion which we may think useful. We remain anonymous in the face of this vast accumulation.
You know what the
Our consumption has a pleasing passivity to it. Of course, no storage mechanism is perfect.
By the way, the library, Brown Library still looks like this. still, and you can go and get the books out yourself. You don't need to.
We face a very simple problem, the decline of literacy, which anyone can see in the latest test scores. Students who are ill at ease with language are just plain scared of poetry. They realize it's a particular and specialized form of discourse. The irony is that it may be the best way to help them sharpen their skills. But
so I wanted to point out two things that he says. He presents this whole experiment that he did with Andy Van Dam, okay, as a response to the decline of literacy, okay, not necessarily digital literacy. Digital literacy is beginning at that time, you know, it's very, very, and as a response to the fear of poetry, that students are fear of poetry. Keep that in mind because it's an interesting question, you know, interesting.
You can't coerce them. We have other problems of our own, of course. It's not simply the students' problem. We're short on resources and manpower. We cannot give students the individual attention that might help them over this difficult spot. And we also have not been really good at inventing new techniques in the classroom that might make poetry more attractive to the timid student. At Brown, we're trying a new solution using a system developed by a computer scientist, Andy Van Dam, which can take poetic materials and other associated things and store it in a cross-referenced manner which will enable students to have access to a poem itself, to background materials, other poems related, poems from the tradition of poetry, critical materials, things that will help the student to see the poem in a full context and understand it in its roots and its ramifications.
So, pretty elementary notions nowadays. Notice that this is an absolutely text-centric environment. I mean, you know, it's a very, very, you'll see in a moment the computer, it's actually connected to a mainframe computer, and you know, which actually has less computing power than, you know, but I mean in a magnitude that is mind-boggling. But they could do things about that. So pedagogy and text-centric. No, we are still far away from graphic interface. Andy Van Dam became one of the pioneers, really, of the graphic, which changed, in a sense.
Using this system, we hope that we can take some of the fear of poetry out of the student, and also that we can solve some of our own problems of communication and innovation in the classroom, that we'll be able to put students in contact with one another through the system about the poetic materials, and that instructors and students will also achieve a higher level of communication and a greater understanding of the materials involved.
So, this is how they
In preparing for the computer-based course, the first step is to gather the raw materials, the primary and secondary texts. The instructor selects manuscripts and portions of manuscripts that relate best to the central themes of the course. Then the material is organized, given an initial structure. The poetry course material is broken into 12 units, each of which concentrates on a particular poem. The students will have 3 sessions with each unit. At the first session, they will view only the poem which is central to the unit. At the second session, they will view material to place the poem in context. This material includes biographical and genre information, other poems by the same poet, and poems by other poets which influenced or have been influenced by the central poem. At the third session, secondary source material will be added. After reading some or all of the material in each session, the student will add his or her comments to the information available at the next session. The instructors and students will all have an opportunity to add comments and questions to evaluate and critique each other's work. Each new arrangement of a text provides the opportunity for something greater than simple transmission. If various texts can be interestingly arranged, juxtaposed, fitted with each other, and played off against each other, the process of reading a text can be made concrete, and the text itself may no longer be isolated, pristine, and inviolate, but manifold and pluralistic. This web of interrelated text is called a hypertext, the computer system we use to create and manipulate hypertext.
We'll watch 2 more minutes because Andy Van Damme comes in and explains it. It's interesting the way he explains it. But can you imagine, this is the computer, and all the work that went into preparing the material, cutting and pasting, but physically, and not because, of course, now we do all these things in a fraction of time, thanks to our computing application, etc. At that time, they started doing, because the idea was that once we put them in the computer, the computer will give them back to us in a way that will sort of familiarize and would make easier for us to read poetry, understand poetry in context, and to win our fear of poetry. So it's kind of mind-boggling, if you think you have to put this huge apparatus in between with a book, in a sense, and a poem on a book, you can have a content. But so interesting that at that time in history, that we thought about computing as a possibility of rescuing a traditional humanistic, enterprise like reading poetry. And the way it's presented to me is really interesting.
It's called press.
Other aspects, more technical, and this is...
Press, which is the computer system being used in the poetry course, takes no particular training in order to operate it beyond an ability to type. And we use the keyboard to specify commands to the system, which set up questions, insert comments, and browse through the system in a manner to set up dialogues. A dialogue not only with poetry, but also with professors, with other students in the course. This dialogue feature can be used as little or as much as possible at the student's own behest, and he can use initials of himself or of other students to browse selectively through a particular set of comments or a particular set of questions. And furthermore, what is really exciting is he can blaze a new trail by looking at themes or images in a set of poems and entering his thoughts into the hypertext for others.
Okay, we'll stop here because we don't have the time. I'll put it's in the linked to the PowerPoint so you can look at the whole thing. It's very interesting as a historical document. But it's also interesting what he's saying, because we said, there is a more direct relationship, access to a poem if you read it on a page. There is no apparatus between your mind and the text. But yet, what they are trying to, by putting the computer, this complex apparatus, and doing all the work in between the reader and the poem, they thought that they would create the possibility of interaction, of further interaction. This is the very important element, which is important in both the pedagogical and the artistic configuration of electronic literature and digital language arts. It's eminently interactive at a critical level, in a learning perspective, or interactive in a more artistic performing perspective. Okay, so I just wanted to play because I love this idea of having this huge, machines just for looking at a poem. It's mind-boggling to us. And yet, all the operations that we do today with our much more sophisticated devices on things like that are already, in a sense, pre-configured there, or at least envisioned there to some extent. Okay, so we'll go to more exciting things if we go back to the presentation, and I hope more exciting. So here's Andy. Almost today, a few years ago, I worked with Andy on a different project. I won't spend time on it, etc. But Andy is still very much, we had this artifact which belongs to an analog world because it's a panorama, a moving panorama. It's a long painting, 84 meters long, etc. And the interesting thing is not a work it's not a work of literature, but yet it is almost a graphic novel. It's the story of Garibaldi, told as almost a precursor of the cinema, And we actually, I'm going to mention, because I'm going to give you now a sense of how far we went from 1976 to today. We had an installation a few years ago in 2011 in Sala Borsa, in Piazza Coperta in Sala Borsa, in which we brought the application that Van Damme created with his students, in order to interact with this huge painting that we could not touch because it's too delicate, as a historical artifact. It was archived, restored, and archived the moment it was acquired by the library. But we wanted to play with it, to interact, to study it, etc. And so look at the age. The most exciting part of is that this objects, this way of interacting with cultural objects, including artistic objects, etc., is very appealing for a new generation of born digital users. Like, for example, these guys, which tested our equipment, because they understood immediately that this was an haptic, a touch screen, etc. And so they wanted to jump inside, etc. So, and this is actually a spontaneous thing. There is an image, a 2D image. I want to jump in, and so we'll see in a moment that this is exactly what's happening now in our evolution, etc. So let's leave and so second. Protagonist that I want to mention, a brown, symbol, and a symbol of the whole electronic literature enterprise. Robert Coover, great novelist, postmodern novelist, is 85 and still going strong. He just published a wonderful book, which is a sequel to the Huckleberry Finn of Mark Twain. He thinks that Mark Twain, it picks up the narrative after, years after, etc., what happened after, and it's a wonderful book, if you want to read it. It's a very postmodern writer, the generation of the Donald Barthelme, John Barth, if you're familiar with American literature, Pynchon, Thomas Pynchon, a little younger, but nevertheless very enjoyable. He really did not practice e-writing, but became a guru of electronic literature, and we'll see in a moment. Some exceptions, but I want to call him because he wrote in 1992 a famous article that he published on the New York Times book review, "The End of Books." Okay, 1992. All this that was happening, hypertext, the evolution of personal computing in particular, etc. So only a couple of years after I landed at Brown, the idea was that, we were really turning the page. The print is becoming obsolete, and books are becoming, when I say books, I say printed books, but also the codex, as such, is a much more influential and important, historically important. We know that this is not exactly what happened, or not yet. And yet, the project I'm involved right now is really the idea of inventing a format that goes beyond books while preserving some of the characteristics of the book. It's called the Digital Monograph, but it's, like the e-book, the possibilities of, this sort of establishing a link between the past, the codex form, and our digital formats. So, sort of combining the best of the two possibilities. At the time when Bob Coover wrote this very influential article, the idea was, oh no, this will replace that, as to quote Victor Hugo. When he sees the cathedral and the book, and he says, in this is the Gobbo di Notre Dame, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and he's saying the book will replace that, the cathedral. It's a wonderful quote because clearly didn't happen yet, but certainly the relationship between printed culture, the revolutionary aspect of printed culture and traditional culture embodied in this monument, etc. This has also changed, of course, in contemporary time. So what did he argue, Coover? He argued that hypertext, he was talking about hypertext, okay? Are you with me? Are you getting tired, etc.? I'm rushing a little because I really want to get to the interesting part. The history is taking a little longer than I thought, but it's good to have a historical perspective. So hypertext, he defined hypertext as such, not a system. This is clearly not Andy Van Daan's point of view. Andy Van Daan considered a system that can do a lot of things, and this notion of system, writing system, editing system, etc., is very important for everything we do, no? Okay. It's not a system, but a generic term coined a quarter of a century ago by a computer populist named Ted Nelson to describe the writing done in the nonlinear or non-sequential space made possible by the computer. The nonlinear, the non-sequential space made possible by the computer. So the computer opens up a new writing space. What Coover, as a writer, is interested in writing, and what changes in terms of writing when we do it on the computer, okay? A new space opens up that is non-sequential and non-linear. Now, Coover wrote novels. He's a narrative author. And so, linearity and sequentiality is very important. Even if Calvino, Cortázar, Borges, and others, taught us that literature may not be linear, and telling a story may be done differently if you read some of their books, etc. But nevertheless, the challenge of linearity is still there. And he basically says, well, in printed culture, and the book in particular, it's difficult to get rid or get free from this linearity and sequentiality, okay? Because the reading and writing, when we talk about writing, we mean about reading, etc. But perhaps we can configure a new kind of writing that can, in turn, trigger a new kind of reading that doesn't obey the laws of linearity, etc. This was the utopian idea. To some extent, it came through and generated a number of works, and we're going to see a couple of them. A couple of works that were called hypertext fiction. And they were not, the attempt to create an alternative form to the novels that were printed and read in books. Okay. But he called it the end of books, which is a slightly different thing. It's not the same thing to say, okay, we have a new genre of writing with computers, hypertext fiction, etc., that, sort of changes the rules to some extent of what we consider the literary. And one other thing is instead saying, well, the books are over. The books as a medium, as a support, as a platform, and reading, the kind of reading, and reading, intensive reading, if you want, as opposed to extensive, etc. There is a lot about, of course, reading forms, etc. Is over. Will be replaced by other forms of reading, etc. What we practice every day, when we do this, fragmentary, multitasking, whatever you want to call it, extensive reading, fragmentary reading, etc. And so art has to go, has to accompany this evolution. In fact, has to perhaps even go ahead of this and show, the possibilities of this kind of different ways of writing, reading. In fact, Landau called it reading with a W, reading, because it was writing and reading together, because even a reader, when he reads in an interactive form, is almost rewriting what he reads, and not necessarily in his mind. Hypertext allows you to follow different paths, non-linear paths. We'll see that in a second. So, So basically, Coover's engagement with hypertext was motivated by his interest in what he calls the subversion of the traditional bourgeois novel, and in fiction, the challenge in linearity. So this was an avant-garde enterprise, that is particularly Marx. But this was done. This was done in print before. I mean, this escape from linearity is done in print. Was done in print. A futurist text like Zang Tum Tum by Marinetti, Guillaume Apollinaire, Tout terriblement, which is a poem that takes various shapes, etc., etc. I mean, it was done in print. So again, the reversibility. Now, computer artists, digital language arts, take inspiration from the historical avant-gardes in order to create and repeat some of the forms in digital format, enhancing visual poems. And we'll see them in a second. One of the authors most important authors of hypertext fiction is Michael Joyce. With that name, you have to be a writer, I guess, even if it's Michael and not James. But Michael Joyce was the author of what is called, actually, Coover called him the granddaddy, the grandfather of hypertext fiction. Coover wrote an important work, Afternoon, a Story, which was published in 1987 by Eastgate Hypertext System. It's a publishing house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's been a pioneering publishing house. If you go to their website, you find a lot of these early works. You can buy them, of course, if you have way to running them, etc. Software is crucial in this evolution, because what Eastgate Publishing did at that time was, and Michael Joyce and Jay Bolter were the authors, and with Stuart Moulthrop contribution, of a software in addition to novels. So they wrote a software in order to write novels in a hypertext format. Okay, so we go back to the idea of the code. Artists in the digital language arts have to, craft their own tools, their own instruments, the writing instruments, in order to produce the works that they have in mind. Okay, the nonlinear, non-sequential works, etc. Here, for instance, this is not by Michael Joyce, but is another work by I forgot the author of Wu. And here you see how the environment, the writing environment, was hypertext. I started my apprenticeship in hypertext using this software. It looks like boxes. Each box contains other boxes, and each box contains, strings of text, and strings of text that are linked to other strings of text. So this interface, this very simple, elementary, almost rudimentary interface, was the way this writing space was configured. Okay? You could be Chinese boxes. You could reconfigure. But what did artists do with this? For instance, Bob Coover and his group in the hypertext fiction workshop at Brown, in which I sort of participated as a student. I was a professor, but I wanted to learn. So I sat, with the students and other students, and we practiced this. They thought, oh, these boxes look like hotel rooms. So they created an entire network of fictions that worked as a hotel. And, and there is an interesting definition of, let me see if I find it, of this hypertext hotel. Unfortunately, it became a MOO, so a multi-object oriented dungeon, so a place where you could also starting to include images along with text, etc. But unfortunately, I couldn't find a live version on the web, and there might be some films around. But it was a very interesting, because it's a collective work. All the class, all the students in the class, in writing class, and we're talking about creative writing class, participated in this network of narratives in which, set in a hotel. And Coover, and this is the software they used, hypertext writing environment, okay? So this idea of you find another very interesting discussion of this early phase of hypertext fiction in this interview with Stuart Moulthrop, who was another important author in this first phase of hypertextual narrative. I'll put it. But here what other artists could do. This is perhaps one of the most important works produced in story space. But see the difference between the boxes. I wanted to quote for a moment how Coover described the hotel. Let's go back for a moment before we go to Shelley Jackson, Patchwork Girl. And he says, here, writers are free to check in, to open up new rooms, new corridors, new intrigues. You can create those boxes, configure them as, rooms, even with a rudimentary graphic interface. New intrigues, new plot lines, okay? Unlink texts or create new text, new links. Intrude upon or subvert the text of others. You could rewrite what others have written, like in a wiki or in any writing environment in which this. So collaboration meant also this kind of an interesting collective author that started to take shape, okay, in this, thanks to the possibility offered by the software, which was conceived with those and programmed, with those possibility and functionality. You can manipulate time and space, engage in dialogue, remember Andy Van Damme, dialogue, a different kind of dialogue with a machine for Andy Van Damme, here with other authors and the reader through software, but that's the idea that the interactivity is still prominent. And you can even kill another character, erase it, etc. So it's it's an interesting environment that evolves as Michael Joyce would say, as we go. As we go, this creative space and writing space changes along. It's not like the novel, there is once it's written, it's fixed. That's it. You can, read differently, but the story is laid down in a way. Here, the story can be rewritten in many different ways. Every time you use the software within a certain limit, it would be interesting to analyze it. But is this a genre? Is this a new revolutionary system that will revolutionize literature as we know it? Is this a fad of a moment? Something that, how many people practice fiction, hypertext fiction today? Not many. We all participate in something. There are new forms that are, we'll be surprised, but I'll show you in a second some. But this kind of enterprise is very historically specific. Is at that point in the evolution of the idea of what electronic literature could be, the softwares that we were, writing, the code that we would enable to process that kind of idea of literature, and this idea of interactivity, or collective enterprise in which we all participate. Okay, so Patchwork Girl. Here comes an author, Shelley Jackson, cyberpunk writer, as some have called her, although she's a very interesting artist, etc., still very much active, and she is a feminist, clearly, and here is how she designed the interface of her work. And, so here is a hypertext, except that she's mapping her own body, is inspired by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So it's a she Frankenstein, she's the monster, but also there is the patchwork, there is another work that is lesser known, but is very well known in American literature, Frank Bowman's the Girl of Oz, which is inspired to the Wizard of Oz narrative. So it's a contamination of different literary work. Very, the work of an important, literary mind, etc. But, clearly that's how it works. as a hypertext. You jump, you follow the links. There are links that are internal, and you follow a narrative thread, which is linked to an exploration of Mary Shelley's, Shelley Jackson, etc., body. And she's a body artist to some extent. Graffiti and tattoos, etc., are very much part of her imagination. If I had time, I would tell you of another important work that she imagined, in which she tattooed 1,000 people with the different tattoos that together would make a narrative, a story. I mean, not visually. I mean, she found 1,000 volunteers, which volunteered to have a tattoo in one part of the body, and then she imagined this reunion of all the fragments of her text, and they would come together, but also they would interact with each other in a way that would recompose this text made of tattoos. So we're talking about avant-garde art here, okay? Experimentations but you see, a very interesting idea. The scar on my upper lip, we can read it. A slight thickening. We go back. My ragged cuticles start singing. Stung like critics. So, I mean, you can explore this hypertext, and you can go in circles sometimes, but you can find new paths and also new visual configurations. What is interesting is that this is a narrative if you read the whole text, and you can read it as a whole text. That opens up various paths, okay, bifurcating paths, as in Borges, etc. But also it can be read as a poem, sampled, which so in a sense already contains some elements that then are becoming very common in other words. Non vorrei. I have to really I have to speed up because. So here is other pages from interface of Shelley Jackson Patchworker. We are talking about the 1990s still. Here you see how the boxes are there, but they are connected to body parts. So it's an anatomy of the text, etc. Very interesting, fascinating, world. But again, jump ahead to today. John Cayley has replaced Bob Coover now at Brown as a teacher of digital literary arts. And where does he teach, among other things? Here's John. And I'm going to show you a little video because this is how the writing space has evolved from that bidimensional, configuration, which allowed a limited set of possibilities, escaping from linearity, and the constraints of writing for print, okay, or for the codex, for a book, or for etc. See where we've gone, thanks to the evolution of technology, but also thanks to the idea of how we can imagine and reimagine this writing space, in this case, from a bidimensional to a three-dimensional thing. So, again, this is only 10 years apart. Not even, because Coover started to experiment with a smaller version of this, the CAVE, which is an acronym. It's a full immersion virtual reality environment. So the environment that was story space, very rudimentary, looked like a page with some strange, or a window, or a computer window, etc. We have evolved and gone to something that is now practiced at Brown. There's a course. If you go to Brown, you can take John's course. And I've worked in the CAVE myself with my students, here. This is a publicity made for Brown, so it talks about Brown, a little bit. And imagine you wearing goggles.
Brown has been traditionally and in reality incredibly supportive in giving access to making these sort of scientific devices available to artist practitioners.
So look at the text.
I'm John Cayley, and I'm a professor in literary arts. and I direct a track within literary arts in a field I now call digital language arts. Used to be known as electronic writing. I think of myself as a writer and as a poetic writer. I research the relationship between computation and writing as a medium and use of devices for delivery or composition of writing. For instance, I teach in the cave, or this legacy cave, which used to be in applied math and now is in the Arts Center. The cave is an immersive virtual reality device. I call it an immersive stereo 3D audiovisual environment. It's a peculiar and now an apparatus that went through a sort of what they apparently now call the VR winter, the virtual reality winter, and we're coming out of the VR winter into some sort of spring. And this device has survived, and I get to teach a course on writing using immersive VR. What would it mean to write in an artificial 3D space? The move of this cave from applied...
Okay, I'll stop here because we don't have time, but again, you'll be able to watch the whole thing. The interesting thing is that it used to be that in order to take this course, it used to be to know programming, because if you wanted to create something meaningful, significant, you have to work on the code. Now there's an editor, and which is very much like any, a little more sophisticated than, let's say, any kind of editor that allows you. See, this shows you my private predilections for tennis videos, etc. But the idea is that now anybody can do it. You can do it with no notion of, you can go into the cave, use this editor, and configure. John's emphasis is on tridimensional text. How we can think of a poem which is very much inspired to those visual poems and concrete poetry that we saw that was practiced by the avant-garde, but as a sort of a hybrid visual literary object. But you can read those texts. You can interact. There is a voiceover. There is sound. There are images. It's a multimedia environment, okay? So you see the evolution of the possibilities. And you see the little boy that was playing with the touch screen in the Sala Borsa and wanted to jump inside. That's what we have done, And of course, this is also possible on the web now. More, web apps allow you to have some kind of three-dimensional interaction with text mediated by code, etc. What kind of horizons this open for literary arts? It's very interesting. The cave experience is locative. You cannot move it. I mean, you cannot. But as Coover was saying recently, okay, now we're getting to the point when you can download a cave from the cloud in your living room, and maybe you'll be able to play with these objects. This is the kind of futuristic American. There are other problems that might, including Donald Trump, who might, interfere with this kind of vision of a future in which everything, But nevertheless, these are possibilities which are, the artists, writers get very excited about this, and particularly students, apprentices, oh, wow, I can write three-dimensionally. What does it mean? What are the possibilities of designing a text? And, So, very quickly through the last couple of slides, and then we open up to the discussion, because I took way too much time to talk about this. We can skip my book. Right. I wanted to show you this because, to me, is the end of a history of the prehistory of digital language arts. It's only from 2005. It's a work of literary art created in the cave, a collaborative work. Robert Coover, Noah Wardell-Fruin, was the first PhD in both literary arts and computer science at Brown, double doctorate. And they worked on this, which is an elegy to the end of text as we know it, and also, if you wish, the opening of a new horizons. That this was done in the cave, but perhaps this is possible and might happen in environments that are more manageable and are closer to our experience, everyday experience, okay? And let's see if I can, yeah, it's 7 minutes long, but I think it's worth it, and then stop here instead. I wanted to go back and wrap it up. It's called Screen, okay?
In a world of illusions, we hold ourselves in place by memories. Though they may be but dreams of a dream, they seem at times more there than the there we daily inhabit. Fixed and meaningful texts in the indecipherable flux of the world's words, so vivid at times that we feel we can almost reach out and touch them. But memories have a way of coming apart on us, losing their certainty. And when they start to peel away, we do what we can to push them, bit by bit, back in place, fearful of losing our very selves if we lose the stories of ourselves. But these are only minds that hold them, fragile data softly banked. Increasingly, they rip apart, blur and tangle with one another, and swarm mockingly about us, threatening us with absence.
Light over the sill of an unshaded bedroom window, into a woman's eye.
So there are stories, 3 stories that appear, and you can read them, and there is a voice reading 3 different stories that are somewhat 3 characters intertwined. You have to imagine, unfortunately, you have to imagine that you are inside the cave wearing goggles, okay? So everything appears 3-dimensional to you. But I want to bring you to, without spoiler, to what happens and how you can interact with these texts. You can listen to them or read them, but there is a way, the interactive way, that is also inspired by game, and this is another chapter that we haven't touched upon, but of course it's a very important element of interaction, the interaction that you have, that games enable, like computing games and video games, etc. So let's see if we can pick it up from here.
Across his scalp, parting his hair at the roots, untensing the skin. His mother, cutting his hair, soft, but wakes alone, open-mouthed.
Soar from splitting wood, swinging the big axe overhand, thud and alarm clock. Its boxy numbers telling her the time of another continent.
So now something is happening. You see, that's the moment in which a new way of reading is.
Blanket. Smiling.
You can pick words or push them back, they come to you.
These.
In a random way.
Have.
It's pretty
Uh.
there to experience this. Doesn't seem much. You have
For.
save the text. The text integrity, that's the name of the game. Okay, they have to put there the text and the words where they be.
Twists.
Save your memory.
Loose.
Or not.
These. Her.
So you see, she's trying to put them back on the wall.
Hand
Then they start coming fast.
reaches under
So now
back
you are a good player. You
of
can save the text.
deep napping paper pastries
Leaves
thanks
on his fingers.
Find. Her. Must. but
she
Gather.
shoulder by lay to his
Cutting. Then.
sunrise overhead.
feels
And point at the end, the collapse. So I said it's an elegiac play piece, but it involves a number of issues.
We
about the
stare
obstacle.
into the white void of lost memories, a loose scatter about us of what fragments remain. No sense but nonsense to be found there. If memories define us, what defines us when they're gone?
Okay, we stop here. So the idea is that is this not the end of books, but the end of text as we know it, the function that text has had. And so this piece problematizes and performs a dramatic moment, if you want, in the evolution of this digital language arts. The challenge here is what can we salvage from the forms that have been with us for centuries, you know, and the way that we have processed the narrative, etc. When the text itself, processed by code, digital text becomes so evanescent, so obsolescent, so ephemeral, so, you know, depends on a system that you can't, you really cannot win against this system because that's how it is designed to some extent. So there are many interesting philosophical issues at stake here. I'll stop here. I had other examples, and maybe during the discussion, if we have time for a discussion, we can pick up some of the other examples, including, perhaps interestingly enough, the winner of last year's Robert Coover Award in electronic literature, to see other possibilities. You know, this is, to me, the end of a period of experimentation that was very much concerned with what happens to the text in a different space, writing environment, etc., and the attempt to salvage, you know, the whole, if you want, the whole heritage of literature as we know it, in all its instantiations, but doing so through avant-garde kind of experimentation. And then, you know, we'll see after your questions, perhaps I'll show you who won last year. And actually this year the prize was done in 2017, early 2017, and you'll have a sense of how the environments of writing and socializing, actually socializing literature are changing still further. I would like to, I'll put this up and then we'll open up to questions. I wanted just to we'll skip ahead. Let me see if I can skip ahead to, sorry, I had so many slides. We'll go back to that. Well, why not? Why don't I keep this in mind as we discuss, you know, what I said, and maybe we can introduce some of the other ideas in our discussion. If you read there and you have a question about what I said or what Stephanie Strickland writes, which is a digital poet, you know, writes in her A Decalogue, so A Decalogue because it's 11 and not 10 commandments, but also because it's a decalogue, decalogo of electronic literature. And so this sums up a little bit what the possible definitions of electronic literature are. But at least I gave you my you know, a little snapshot of my experience, my engagement, and maybe in the next time I'll give you a sense of what we do now with my students and John Cayley's students, of course. You should have him come. And okay, sorry, I stop here. I took way too much time. I was hoping really to do it in an hour, and then, but we still have 20 minutes, 25 minutes that we can certainly